Her name was never once spoken at that table, and yet she was the last thing left standing as a wager on it that night. It was 2 a.m. in the 12th floor VIP room of the Vermilion, and Maren Doyle was clearing empty glasses the way she had done for 4 years, when her father, who had lost everything, pawned everything, and had nothing left in his pockets, turned around and snatched the small cloth-bound notebook out of his own daughter's apron pocket and threw it down into the pile of chips, saying louder than the hour required that he was staking his daughter, that she was healthy, that she was decent, and that she was worth more than every dollar the rest of them had left combined. 6 men around that table went silent. There are lines that even men who live by gambling do not cross, and Jerry Doyle had just walked clean over one of them in front of his own child. Maren stayed exactly where she was, the tray still level in her hands, and not a single glass fell. Only one man at the end of the table did not laugh and did not look away. Salvatore Corvino, who controlled the docks, the unions, and 3 casinos along the eastern shore, the man the whole city feared not because he raised his voice but because he had never once needed to, simply looked down at the notebook. He opened it. Inside there was no debt slip and no contract. Only 4 years of tips recorded in a woman's steady handwriting. Shift after shift, night after night, never off by a single cent. And on the last page, beside the money still owed to the neighbor who had been sitting with her younger sister for 3 straight weeks, one word had been added in a small uncertain hand. Soon, Salvatore Corvino laid his own cards, face down on the table. The entire room held its breath. And what he said next changed forever the life of a woman he had never spoken a word to. If you want to know what happens when a man finally opens the thing the whole world has thrown away, press the like button so this story can reach more people. Share it with someone you believe deserves to be seen exactly as they are. And subscribe to the channel so you can walk the whole of Maren's journey with us from tonight onward. He spoke very softly. And because he spoke so softly, everyone in the room had to lean toward him to hear. "I'll take the bet," Salvatore said. Jerry Doyle looked up, his eyes clouded with drink, his mouth already twisting into the smile of a man who thought he'd just found prey. But Salvatore wasn't finished. "I'll take it," he continued. "To get it off this table, there won't be a game. Whatever you owe this casino, from this second forward, you don't owe it anymore. All of it, wiped clean. In return, you'll do 3 things. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, my people will bring you papers, and you'll sign them. From tonight until the day you die, you won't speak of what just happened here to anyone. Not to your drinking friends, not to a stranger on a bus, not even to yourself in the mirror. And you will never appear anywhere your daughter is living. Not once." The room went so still that the hum of the air conditioner could be heard. Jerry Doyle blinked several times, and what should have been relief fermented inside him into something else, because a man desperate enough to throw his own child onto a table didn't need to be saved. He needed to win, and salvation delivered by a man like Salvatore Corvino felt to him no different from a slap across the face. "So that's it," Jerry said, his voice turning thick. "You're going to take her without paying a cent, the generous kingpin. You erase a few petty debts, take my daughter home, and everyone in this room gets to call it kindness." Salvatore didn't move. He looked at the man across from him longer than necessary, and when he answered, his voice never rose above a whisper. "Listen carefully, because I won't say this a second time. I'm buying your silence. I'm not buying your daughter. No one at this table can buy her, including me, because she isn't something that can be put on a table, and you aren't a man with the right to put her there. What you just did wasn't a wager. What you just did was drag a woman's name through the dirt in front of 6 men while she stood 3 steps away from you with nothing in her hands but a tray. I'm giving you the one chance you'll ever have to walk out of this building with some small part of your name still intact. Take it, or don't. If you don't, tomorrow morning I'll buy every debt you owe from every person you owe it to. Every last dollar. And then you'll belong to me in a way you'll find considerably less comfortable than the goodwill I'm offering you now. Decide. I'm losing patience. And I never had much of it to begin with." Lord Fenner, at the far end of the table, cleared his throat and looked down at his hands. The dealer held the deck suspended in the air, not daring to set it down. 2 seats away, Renato Corvino, Salvatore's cousin, leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man watching a play that had nothing to do with him. Renato was the only person in the room who had laughed when the notebook fell among the chips. A short, dry laugh, lasting only 3 beats before dying when no one joined him. Salvatore had heard it. He hadn't turned toward him, hadn't said anything, hadn't shown a sign. He had simply filed it away somewhere inside himself, in the place where he kept things whose time hadn't yet come, and closed the lid. Jerry Doyle looked at the paper in Salvatore's hand, then at the man holding it, and one final spark of the father he might once have been flickered across that ruined face before going dark. "Fine," he said thickly. "Fine. Have it your way. The whole house, the girl, that whole cold, miserable mess. I'm done with all of it." He laughed, and the sound broke apart halfway through. "You won't thank me. She's a terror. She keeps notes. She'll look at you exactly the way she always looked at me. If a decent woman ever looks at me the way she looks at a man who's disappointed her," Salvatore replied, "I'll consider myself fortunate. That's more than you deserve, and more than I have any right to hope for." He stood. He picked up the cloth-bound notebook, brushed the dust from the chips off its cover with his thumb, closed it, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, resting it against his chest with the care of a man handling a check worth an entire kingdom. Then he told everyone at the table that the night ended there, and that no one in that room would ever repeat the name that had just been spoken. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever, and he didn't need to know who agreed. He only needed to know who had heard him. Near the door, the shift manager was summoned and ordered to send the server from room 12 home immediately, pay her for the full shift, and call a car for her. Marin Doyle set her tray down on the service table, removed her apron, folded it into a neat square the way she'd done every night for 4 years, and walked out through the VIP room door without looking back at anyone. Not at the man who had just spoken for her. Not even at the man who had given her life. Salvatore would remember that detail for years afterward, that she hadn't looked back, and that her spine had remained straight the entire way to the door. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, he stepped out onto the casino steps. Wind off the sea swept across his face, cold and salted. He stood there for a while. A man who owned docks, unions, and 3 casinos along the East Coast, carrying a cloth-bound notebook in his coat pocket, and a name in his mind that he'd never heard before that night. Marin. He had bought her father's silence. He had erased the man's debt. He had stopped something ugly from happening, and through all of it, not once had he asked himself the only question that truly mattered: what she would think of everything he'd just done on her behalf. Standing on those cold steps, he realized that omission bothered him far more than he wanted to admit. He got home close to 4 o'clock in the morning and didn't go to bed. He sat down in the chair before the fireplace in the stone house in Longport, a house far too large for one man to live in, and took the cloth-bound notebook from his coat pocket, set it on his knee, and opened it. He read it once, from the first page to the last, without skipping a single line, and when he finished, he closed it and never opened it again. Then he sat motionless for a very long time in the darkness and thought about something that had nothing to do with those numbers, or perhaps had everything to do with them. He had owned that building for 8 years. He had signed the papers, paid the salaries, decided who was allowed in and who wasn't, ordered the entire 12th floor renovated in the 3rd year, and read hundreds of reports about the place. And in all those 8 years, he had never once stepped onto the floor of his own building. Never once walked past the rows of slot machines on the ground floor during the busiest hours. Never once stood at a bar long enough to see what the people working there actually looked like. He knew the revenue for every quarter. He didn't know a single face. 7 hours later, at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, he called Augusto Renzi. Gus had been the Corvino family's lawyer for 30 years, had worked for Salvatore's father before he worked for Salvatore, and in those 30 years he had learned that when Salvatore called at this hour, the conversation would be brief and there would be no greeting. "I need an irrevocable trust established," Salvatore said. "The beneficiary is Bertie Doyle, 19 years old, a freshman in college, the younger sister of a woman named Marin Doyle, who works as a server on the 12th floor of the Vermilion. The trust will cover all of the girl's medical expenses, without limit, and all of her tuition, until she finishes whatever she chooses to study. No conditions attached. No one can revoke it, alter it, or suspend it." Gus was silent for a beat on the other end of the line, the kind of silence made by a man who was writing. Then he asked the first question a good lawyer would ask: who would have the authority to change the terms in the future? "No one," Salvatore replied. "Not even me. Draft it so tightly that if I change my mind 5 years from now and call you in the middle of the night telling you to cancel it, you still can't cancel it. And you'll tell me exactly that." Gus asked the second question: who would be notified? "No one," Salvatore said. "Don't notify the girl. Don't notify her sister. The hospital receives payment from a trust office. The school receives tuition from the same office. And if anyone asks, the answer is that it's a student assistance fund. That's all. My name doesn't appear anywhere in the documents." Gus continued taking notes for a while, and in 30 years of working for this family, He had never asked Salvatore a question beyond the boundaries of the work, because he understood those boundaries very clearly, and understanding them was one of the reasons he had lived as long as he had. But that morning he allowed himself exactly one question, and he asked it in the dry, careful voice of a man who knew he was stepping over a line. "Sir, why?" There was no answer on the other end. No sigh, no tapping fingers, no refusal, only silence, lasting long enough for Gus to understand that the question wasn't going to be answered. Not today, and perhaps not ever. And then Salvatore said, "Just draft it. I'll sign it this afternoon," and hung up. Salvatore set the telephone down and remained sitting in the room as daylight slowly filled it. He had just done something he would explain to no one, not even to himself, and he had done it so quickly that 7 hours earlier he hadn't even known there was a person in the world named Bertie Doyle. But that wasn't what troubled him. What troubled him was something else, and it had taken hold of him on the casino steps close to 3 o'clock in the morning and hadn't let go. The night before, he had stood up in a room full of men and made decisions for a woman. He had decided that her name would never be spoken there again. He had decided that her father's debts would be erased. He had decided that the man would never be allowed near her again. That morning he had made yet another decision, this time about her sister's tuition and medical bills. 4 major decisions concerning one person's life, every one of them right, every one of them made for her, and not once had he asked her a single question. She had stood 3 steps away from him through the entire thing, still holding a tray in her hands, and he had never asked what she wanted. He sat there, the man the entire city feared, and realized that among the men in that room the night before, perhaps the difference between him and her father wasn't nearly as great as he had believed, because both of them had stood there deciding something about her, without either man bothering to turn and look at her face. The thought disturbed him far more than he was willing to admit, and it stayed with him for the rest of that day. 2 days later, late one afternoon, Gus Renzi climbed 3 flights of stairs in an old apartment building, 6 blocks from the waterfront, and knocked on the door of apartment 7. He arrived carrying a slim leather briefcase, a completed set of documents, and the restrained expression of a 61-year-old man who knew he was about to tell a stranger things no one wanted to hear from the mouth of a stranger. He had prepared 3 different ways to begin, depending on whether she knew what had happened or not. He didn't need any of them. The door opened, and the woman standing inside looked at him for 1 second, then stepped back to let him pass and said, "Please come in. I assume you're Mr. Corvino's man." She knew. She had known before he ever knocked, because in this city's casino world, rumors traveled faster than anything with wheels. A busser on the 12th floor had a girlfriend who worked the morning shift at the coffee counter on the ground floor, and her girlfriend had a cousin who worked security. And by noon the next day, the entire building knew what had happened in the VIP room at 2 o'clock in the morning. And by evening, even people who didn't work in that building knew. The apartment was small and very clean. Gus looked around once with the trained eye of his profession and saw exactly what he had expected to see. A place where everything that could be sold had already been sold. He sat down in the only chair left at the dining table. And then she did something he would later tell Salvatore about twice during the same report, not because he had forgotten he'd already mentioned it, but because he wanted to emphasize it. She went into the kitchen and made him a cup of tea. There was almost nothing left in that kitchen with which to make tea. He could see it clearly from where he sat. The cabinet doors slightly ajar and empty, a dented tin, an old kettle. And still she made tea, and she set the cup in front of him with both hands in the manner of someone who had been taught to do it that way as a child, and had never found a reason to stop. Gus laid out the terms. He explained them fully and precisely, the way he had done for 30 years, without embellishment and without softening anything. Gerald Doyle's entire debt to the casino had been erased, and no one would pursue him for a single cent. Mr. Doyle had signed the papers at 9 o'clock the following morning and had left the city. He was forbidden from appearing anywhere she lived. Mr. Corvino was prepared to arrange another place for her to live if she wanted one, and was prepared to cover every expense that came with it, and she owed nothing in return. No money, no favor, not even a word of thanks. Marin Doyle listened to all of it. She sat with her back straight and didn't interrupt him once. And Gus had the strange feeling that she was listening in the way a person listens when they intend to remember everything, not when they're simply waiting for their turn to speak. When he finished, she was silent for a while, then asked him one question, and it wasn't one he had prepared himself to answer. She asked, "Is it true that he told my father he was buying his silence, not buying me?" Then she added, "Were those his exact words, sir?" "Exactly those words?" Gus Renzi said yes. "Those were his exact words, Miss Doyle, and I have that from his own account of what happened that night." She gave one very small nod. She didn't cry, didn't ask anything more about her father, didn't ask about the money, and didn't ask what kind of man Mr. Corvino was, which, in Gus's 30 years of experience, was the question most people would have asked within the first 10 seconds. She looked down at her cup of tea for a long time, then raised her eyes and said that she was deeply grateful he had come, that he was a kind man and had been very gentle with her, but that she wouldn't accept any of it through him. Gus asked what she meant. She said that for the past 48 hours, everything about her life had been decided in rooms where she wasn't present, and in the one room where she had been present, she had been the only person who wasn't allowed a voice. Then she said the sentence Gus Renzi would remember for a very long time afterward. "I won't let people decide my life for me a second time through an intermediary, sir. If he has something he wants to say to me, I'll come and hear it from his own mouth. Please arrange it." That evening, Gus returned to give his report. He recounted everything in full, as he always did, and when he was finished, he remained standing for a moment with his hat in his hands, and allowed himself one observation, something he very rarely did. "Sir," he said, "I don't think this is a woman who is easily decided for by anyone. I suspect her father never understood that, and I suspect that may have been the very thing he was least capable of forgiving her for." She arrived at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, wearing a coat worn thin at the cuffs, but pressed smooth along every crease, smooth in the way that can only be achieved with time and hands rather than money. And Salvatore saw it from the moment she crossed the threshold of his office, and in those 3 seconds he understood more about Marin Doyle than her father had learned in 27 years. She had dressed herself to stand before a man like him, and she had nothing to dress herself with, and with her own 2 hands she had turned that nothing into dignity. He stood up. He didn't decide to stand. His body did it before he had time to think, and that was something that hadn't happened to him in many years, and he recognized the strangeness of it the instant it happened. She noticed too. She saw him rise, and something passed briefly across her face before disappearing. She didn't bow any more than necessary. She said, "Mr. Corvino," and sat when invited, her hands resting in her lap, her back straight. Then she spoke before he had the chance to begin, and her voice was as steady as someone reading down a column of figures. "I want you to tell me plainly what you own. Clearly, if you please. I'm accustomed to things being stated clearly." Salvatore Corvino, a man who could silence a table full of men merely by lowering his voice, discovered that he had no prepared answer for this woman, and that his heart was beating in a way it hadn't bothered to beat in 20 years. He answered in the only way she would accept, with a list. "I own a debt that has been erased," he said. "It no longer exists, and no one can collect it, including me. I own a cloth-bound notebook that I carried out of that room and am holding now, and if you want it back, all you have to do is say so. And I own the memory of something very ugly that happened at my gaming table, in my building, beneath a roof for which I am responsible. That is everything I own that has anything to do with you." He paused. "And nothing on that list is you, Miss Doyle. You were never on that table. Your father thought he could put you there. He couldn't. No one can." She was silent. She had entered this room prepared for one kind of conversation, and she was being given another. And he watched her rearrange everything without so much as blinking, exactly the way a good bookkeeper looks at a column that won't balance and doesn't panic, but simply goes back to the beginning. "Then what do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "You don't owe me money. You don't owe me gratitude. You don't owe me a word of thanks. You don't even owe me the trouble of remembering my name once you walk out that door. You can stand up right now and leave, and my car will take you anywhere you want to go in this country, and you'll never have to hear my name again, if that's what you choose." He said it with certainty, though something inside him objected to every word. Then he added, "But before you go, I want you to sit down and eat something. You walked 3 miles to get here because you didn't want to ride in my car. You haven't eaten anything today, and I suspect you didn't eat yesterday either. And I imagine you'd rather die on this carpet than tell me that. There's food. Eat first. Freedom can come afterward. Freedom won't spoil." For the first time, something crossed her face that wasn't composure. It vanished almost immediately. But he had seen it. The expression of someone who, after so many years of feeding other people, keeping house for other people, promising other people that things would get better soon, had suddenly been told that she was the one who had gone without. He rang the bell and food was brought in, and he watched her eat in a way that made something inside him quietly break. She ate in small bites, carefully, steadily, like someone who had taught herself long ago never to let anyone see that she was hungry. and it took a long while before she truly believed that no one was going to come and take the plate away. When she began to believe it, Salvatore turned toward the window and looked down at the road below, not because there was anything out there, but because he didn't want to embarrass her by watching. When she finished, she folded her napkin into a neat square and placed it beside the plate. Then she sat straighter and laid out her circumstances, and she presented them like an accounting statement, without begging for a single thing, without lowering her voice, giving him the numbers of her life exactly as she had once given the numbers of a house that was falling apart. My mother has been dead for 6 years. My younger sister's name is Birdie. She's 19, she's in her first year of college, and she's the only reason I've worked the night shift for 4 years straight. My father is gone, and I know he won't come back, and I don't want him to. I'll lose the apartment I'm living in this month, because I paid the last 3 months of rent with tips, and this month there isn't enough. I have 1 box of clothes, and I've just had a stain put on my name in an industry where a stain is the only thing people remember about a server. She raised her chin just slightly, no more than that. So I thank you for the meal and for speaking plainly. 2 things I haven't received from anyone in a year. But please don't insult me with pity dressed up as a car ride. Just tell me the truth about where I stand, and let me stand there and face it. Salvatore looked at her for a long time, then said there was one truth about her situation that he had been considering since 3 o'clock that morning, and that he wasn't going to be the one to tell her, because she would believe it more readily if she heard it from someone who had nothing to gain from any of this. He called Gus Renzi in. Gus set his leather briefcase on the table, sat down, and explained things the way he had explained everything for 30 years, beginning with what was most certain and moving gradually toward what was most unpleasant. He said her father's debt to the casino had been erased, and that was final. No one could collect a single cent of it, now or in the future. But he added that her father hadn't owed money only to the casino. Over the past 2 years, after the casinos stopped extending him credit, Jerry Doyle had borrowed from a private lending operation on the north side of the city, and that operation belonged to a man named Cormac Halloran. Mr. Corvino didn't control it. Mr. Corvino couldn't erase it. Marin asked how much money it was, and Gus told her that was the wrong question, and apologized for having to say so. He explained that Cormac Halloran didn't need her father's money. To a man like him, the amount was pocket change. What Halloran needed was a wedge, an opening, something he could drive into Corvino territory, and he had been looking for one for 7 years without finding it. Then Gus came to the most unpleasant part, and he spoke slowly, so she could understand every word. That night, Miss Doyle, your name was spoken openly in front of 6 men at a table. In the world where I've spent my entire life working, that has a very specific and very bad meaning. It means you've been placed on the board. Before that night, you were a server whose name no one knew. After that night, you became someone that anybody, wanting leverage over Mr. Corvino, would know to look for, because all 6 of those men saw him stand up for you with their own eyes. And in that world, a man like him standing up for someone is never a small thing. You aren't uninvolved anymore. You've become leverage. And worse, leverage that belongs to no one. Something lying in the road that no one has picked up yet. And Cormac Halloran already has a line leading to you through your father's debt, which he will leave untouched rather than collect, because an unpaid debt is more useful than one that's been settled. Marin sat still. Then she said she would leave. She said she could be out of New Jersey within the week, go to another state, choose a city large enough that no one would notice her, find another job, and change her name if she had to. She said she had nothing to lose by leaving, that all she owned was 1 box of clothes, and that she was ready. Gus Renzi looked down at his hands for a moment before answering, because he was 61 years old, and he didn't like the sentence he was about to say. Then he said it. Miss Doyle, you can change your name. You can't change your sister's follow-up schedule. The room went silent. She's 19, he continued. She's a freshman at a school anyone can find in 3 minutes, and according to the records, she has a fixed recurring appointment on the same morning every month at a hospital with an address, in a city with a name. You can disappear from the face of the earth, Miss Doyle. She can't, unless you tell her to leave school and stop going to her appointments, and I suspect you'd rather die than ask her to do that. They don't have to find you. They only have to wait somewhere they know you will eventually have to go. Marin Doyle sat for a very long time after that. She didn't cry, didn't stand, didn't say anything at all. She looked down at the 2 hands resting in her lap, the hands that had carried trays for 4 years. And Salvatore watched the moment when a person began calculating her options and crossing them out one by one, and he knew that feeling very well, and he knew just as well the silence that came after the last option had been crossed away. He didn't fill that silence. He had learned over a lifetime of negotiation that the person who filled the silence was the person who was losing, and never in his life had he wanted less to win. At last she looked up and met his eyes directly, not Gus's, and she asked in that steady voice he was beginning to recognize as the one she used to keep herself from trembling. "Then what are you going to do, Mr. Corvino? You said you've been thinking about this since 3 o'clock that morning. So what did you come up with?" Salvatore Corvino looked at the woman in the carefully pressed coat, the woman who had walked 3 miles rather than accept a ride, the woman who had just listened to an accounting of the trap closing around her without shedding a single tear, and he said there was exactly one way. "Only one," he said. "I've looked for 3 days, and there isn't a second one. You won't like it, and I'm fairly certain you'll refuse it, and you'll refuse for reasons I will respect. But you asked me to speak plainly, so I'm going to speak plainly, and you can throw it back in my face, and I won't think less of you for it." Quite the opposite. He said the only way was for her to take his name. He said it without emphasis, without lowering his voice to make it easier to hear, exactly the way a man might read a clause in a contract. And he continued immediately before she had time to react, because he knew that if he left a silence, she would fill it with outrage and never hear the rest. "These are all the terms," he said, "and I want you to hear every one of them before you answer. You will have your own room at the opposite end of the house, and you will have your own life, and I will not enter that part of your life unless you invite me into it. There will be a trust established in your name, your money, administered by a third party, and drafted so tightly that I can't touch a single cent of it. Not today, not 10 years from now, not even if I change my mind. All of your sister's medical expenses and tuition will be paid without condition. And when I say without condition, I mean the literal meaning of those words, even if you leave tomorrow morning. And you will have the right to walk away from this marriage at any hour of any day, taking every dollar held in your name, without giving a reason, without giving notice, owing me no money and owing me no explanation. That's all. There are no other terms, and there are no hidden ones." Marin sat still through all of it. Then she said, slowly and very clearly, that there was a hole in his contract. She said that if the only thing keeping her safe was the Corvino name, then this supposed right to leave was nothing but words on paper, because the day she walked out the door would be the day she lost the very thing that had kept her alive. "You're giving me an open door," she said. "And you know perfectly well that beyond that door is the place I was just pulled out of. That isn't freedom. That's a cage with a picture of a door painted on the wall." Salvatore didn't argue at once. He gave a single nod, as though acknowledging an error in a ledger. And then he said the words she would remember for the rest of her life. "You're right, if that protection leaves with me. But it won't. If you leave, it stays exactly where it is. I won't withdraw it. Anyone who touches you will still be touching me. And that will remain true if you live 3,000 miles from here. It will remain true if you change your name. It will remain true if you never answer another call from me until the day I die. I will give that order once, in front of the people who need to hear it. And an order like that doesn't need to be repeated. You will carry that armor anywhere you choose to go, including away from me." He paused for a beat. "I'm not marrying you to keep you. I'm marrying you precisely to make you a woman no one in this country can own, including me, especially me." She looked at him for a long time, and this time her gaze was different. Then she asked why. "Please don't tell me it's to protect a stranger. Men who control entire harbors don't marry unemployed servers out of kindness. There's a reason. I want to know what it is." Salvatore considered for 1 second whether he should give her the polished answer, and discovered something strange. He couldn't produce it in front of her. It simply wouldn't take shape. She had a way of making every rehearsed sentence feel dirty, so he told her the truth. "Because I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who want something from me," he said. "Every one of them, no exceptions. People want money. They want protection. They want a name they can mention. They want a favor. They want me to remember their faces. I've grown so accustomed to being needed that I forgot there was something else. Something called being seen. 3 days ago, a woman walked 3 miles rather than get into my car, came into my house, and wanted nothing from me except the truth. You're the first person in 20 years. I don't expect you to care for me. I don't ask it of you, and I never will. But I want to live under the same roof as whatever it is you carry inside you. And I find that I'm willing to pay a great deal for that, even if the price is my name. That's the reason. It isn't beautiful, and it isn't romantic. It's simply true." Marin Doyle stood. She walked to the window and stood in the exact place where he had stood for the past 2 nights, looking down at the same road, and he didn't hurry her. A long time later, she turned back and said she would give him her answer in the morning. "Not because I'm trying to make you wait," she said, but because in one afternoon you've taught me that a sentence spoken too quickly can ruin an entire life. My father took only 4 seconds to say one sentence, and those 4 seconds took away everything I had. I won't decide the rest of my life in the same hour I've just been pulled out of that place. I'm asking you for a decent, private place to sleep tonight, and tomorrow morning I will give you one answer, yes or no. And whichever answer it is, I will mean it. And whichever answer it is, I won't cry over it. Are those terms you can accept, Mr. Corvino? Salvatore said they were the first terms in 20 years he hadn't needed to bargain down by a single word, and that he accepted them, completely. That night, in the guest room at the opposite end of the house where the housekeeper had shown her, Marin sat on the edge of the bed and called her younger sister, and she told her everything, leaving out none of the terms and softening not a single word, because she hadn't lied to Bertie once since their mother died and she wasn't going to begin tonight. Bertie listened to all of it, and then went silent for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Marin knew her sister was trying not to cry. Then Bertie said no. You can't do this, she said, and her voice broke. I know what you're doing. You're paying with your whole life for me. You're taking 27 years of your life and putting them down in exchange for my appointments and my tuition, and I don't want that price. I never wanted that price. I'd rather leave school, she said. For 4 years you've worked the night shift because of me. You've eaten dinner at 4 o'clock in the morning because of me. You've worn that same coat through 3 winters because of me, and now you're going to marry a man you've met once because of me too. When are you ever going to do something that isn't for me? Marin let her finish. Then she spoke in the steady voice she always used when someone needed to be kept from falling. Listen to me, Bertie. I'm not sacrificing myself. I'm choosing. Those are 2 completely different things. And I need you to understand the difference. Because if you don't, you'll carry this imaginary debt for the rest of your life, and I won't allow that to happen. Sacrifice is when there's no other road left, and a person closes their eyes and walks forward. Choice is when a person sees every road clearly and takes one. I've seen them clearly. I spent the entire afternoon making sure I did. Then she continued, and her voice changed slightly. Do you know the strangest part of all this? In 27 years, no one has ever given me a choice. People only gave me consequences. Mom died. That was a consequence, and I took it. Dad gambled. That was a consequence, and I took it. The rent went up. The shop closed. I lost my job. I took all of it, and I got very good at taking things. I think I'm probably the best person in the world at accepting whatever somebody else puts down in front of me. This afternoon was the first time in my life a man laid the terms on a table, read every one of them to me, then stepped back and told me to decide for myself, and told me plainly that if I said no, I would still get everything. Do you understand how rare that is? I'm not going to let it pass me by, Bertie. Not because he's rich, because for the first time in my life, I'm the one holding the pen. The next morning, she came down to the dining room at 7 o'clock, and he was already sitting there, because it turned out they were both early risers. She sat down, poured herself tea, and drank half the cup before speaking. And before she spoke, she set the cup down on its saucer, set it all the way down so that both of her hands could be still. I've decided, she said, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I don't want you thinking I'm choosing you out of fear or hunger, and either of those things would poison everything from the beginning. I'm not choosing you. I'm choosing the terms. A woman who is offered a room of her own, money of her own held in her own name, a name that protects her sister, and the right to walk out the door at any time without owing anyone a cent, would be a fool to walk out that door this morning. I won't accept if you expect me to be grateful, or charming, or anything other than honest. You're asking only for honesty. I can afford that. It's the only thing I have left. She looked directly at him. So yes, under exactly the terms you've given me. And if you have books that need looking after, I'd like the job, because I can't stand sitting idle, and I suspect the accounts in your house, if they're anything like what I've seen in homes whose owners are too rich to bother looking at them, are probably a complete disaster. Salvatore said he had never opened a ledger in his life. Then we'll be fine, she said. Better than either of us thinks, which doesn't mean good, and I'm making no promises beyond the books. But at the corner of her mouth there was something that nearly became a smile and then didn't. And Salvatore Corvino found that he wasn't in any hurry at all, that he could wait a very long time to see that smile come all the way out, and he wouldn't consider the waiting a hardship. They signed the papers at City Hall 9 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with exactly 2 witnesses, as required by law, Gus Renzi and the housekeeper. No announcement to anyone, no photographs, nothing. Marin wore a gray dress she had chosen herself. Bertie sat in the front row, and in that entire small room, She was the only person smiling, and she smiled from beginning to end. For the first 3 weeks in the stone house at Longport, Marin Doyle gave orders to no one. The housekeeper had prepared herself for a new mistress of the house, had spoken with the staff about waiting to see which way the wind would blow, and then discovered that this woman didn't blow in any direction at all, but simply walked down to the kitchen on Monday morning and asked the cook his name, then asked how long he had worked there, then sat at the corner of the table with a cup of tea while he worked and said nothing more. By the second day, she knew the names of everyone employed in the house, and knew who had young children, who came to work on which bus route. By the third day, she knew that the hot water pipes in the East Wing had been causing trouble since 2 winters earlier, that someone had reported it and someone had written it down and then no one had done anything, and she asked who was responsible for repairs. And when she was told that everything had to go through the office, she merely nodded and said nothing else. She didn't touch anyone's books. She didn't ask for any authority. She simply watched, the way someone watches after spending 4 straight years having to find every possible place to save $5. At the end of the 3rd week, one morning at the breakfast table, she placed something in front of Salvatore that he hadn't seen since the night on the 12th floor, and he recognized it immediately. The cloth-bound notebook, battered and curled at all 4 corners, together with a loose sheet of paper on which she had drawn columns herself with a ruler. He had returned it to her on their wedding day without saying anything, and now it had found its way back to his table. "I want to make something clear from the beginning," she said. "I don't know accounting. I studied for 2 years and didn't finish, and I'm not qualified to read the books of a casino, and I haven't touched anyone's accounts in the 3 weeks I've been here. You can ask anyone in this house. There's only one thing I know. I know how many glasses I've carried over the last 4 years. She opened the notebook and turned it toward him. "Every night, I wrote down my tips the moment I left the floor, because tips were cash and I couldn't afford to be wrong by even 1 cent. I also wrote down how many tables had customers during the shift, because tips in room 12 were pooled, and I needed to know what I was supposed to receive so I'd know if I had been shorted. 4 years. Every single night. I wasn't keeping records for any particular reason. I kept them because my mother taught me to keep records." She placed one finger on the sheet, divided into columns. "Look at this. There were nights when room 12 was packed, every table filled, high rollers everywhere. Nights when I couldn't move fast enough to breathe and my feet hurt so badly, I had to soak them in salt water when I got home. And yet the tips after they were divided came out lower than on nights when the room was nearly empty. Not once. Over 4 years, it happened more than 30 times. I counted again last night. At first I thought I was remembering it wrong, because people remember exhausting nights badly, but I wrote down the number of tables. A number of tables can't remember wrong." Salvatore said nothing. He lowered his eyes to the paper. "And on those nights," she continued, "2 things were always the same. The first was the delivery schedule of one liquor supplier, always the same company name. I remember because their truck used to block the employee entrance, and everyone working nights had to walk around it, and all of us complained about that truck for 4 years. The second was Mr. Wendell Pike's floor shift. Not most of the time, not nearly all of the time, every time, more than 30 nights, without a single exception." She withdrew her hand and placed it in her lap. "I don't know what's happening inside your building. I don't know enough to tell you, and I won't say something I'm not certain of. I only know one very simple thing, and I'm telling it to you in the only language I have. These numbers don't match what my feet remember." Then she added one more thing, and she said it more slowly, because she had spent 2 nights deciding whether she should say it at all. "There's something else I noticed when I went back through the notebook, and I don't understand what it means yet. My father had his credit cut off in room 12 more than 2 years ago. Everyone knew it. Every shift manager knew it. But sometimes he was still allowed to stay at the table and keep playing. I wrote down the nights my father was there, because on those nights I traded shifts with someone else so I wouldn't have to serve his table." She looked at. "My father was only given credit on those same nights. Those more than 30 nights. No others." She closed the notebook and pushed the sheet of paper toward him. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not saying anyone is guilty. That's your business, and I don't interfere in your business. I only thought you should know the numbers, because I can't stand looking at something that's wrong and leaving it there wrong, when all it takes is a pen and one evening to find where it stops making sense." Salvatore Corvino looked at the paper for a very long time. He looked at it so long that she began to think perhaps she had gone too far. But what kept him silent wasn't the money. The money was the smallest part of all of this. He could lose 10 times that amount and feel nothing. What kept him silent was something entirely different. He had owned that building for 8 years. He had signed every contract, approved every expense, read hundreds of reports prepared by people paid very well to tell him what was happening inside it. And a woman who had lived in his house for 3 weeks, armed with nothing more than a cloth-bound notebook and a ruler, had just seen that building more clearly than he had seen it in 8 years. 3 days later, Wendell Pike was no longer at the Vermilion. There was no announcement. No one said anything to anyone. He simply didn't come in on Thursday morning, or Friday, and by the end of the week his name had been removed from the scheduling board in Human Resources, as though it had never been there at all. Marin heard about it through the housekeeper, who had heard it from the driver, who had heard it from a security guard. She waited another day. She waited because she wanted to be certain she was asking with a clear head, rather than out of fear. Then the following evening, at the dinner table, she set down her knife and fork and asked her husband directly what he had done to Mr. Pike. Salvatore set down his glass. He didn't lie. He didn't soften anything. He didn't ask why she wanted to know, and he didn't change the subject. And later she would remember that this was the moment she began to trust this man, not the moment he had stood up for her at the gaming table. You asked, so I'll answer you completely, including the part you won't like. He told her that when he finished reading the paper she had given him, the first thing he did was call 2 men, and he gave her both of their names, and told her the purpose of those calls in words that weren't dressed up to sound better than they were. He said that for 20 years, something like this had only ever ended one way, and everyone who worked for him knew what that way was, and it was precisely because they knew that no one had dared to do such a thing in 8 years. He said that was what he had intended to do, and he said it while looking directly into her eyes, without blinking, without apologizing. Then he told her what he had done instead. He said he had sat in his car for 40 minutes before making the 3rd call, and the 3rd call had been to Gus Renzi. The entire file, every invoice from that liquor supplier over 4 years, every floor schedule, every tip distribution sheet, all of it had been copied and turned over to the New Jersey gaming authorities and to the federal authorities through the proper channels, with lawyers involved and receipts documenting everything. It was enough to put Wendell Pike in prison for many years, and he would go to prison. Because in this state, people could forgive many things, but they didn't forgive someone for siphoning money out of a casino because the entire state lived on the licenses of those casinos. Marin asked why he had changed his mind. Salvatore was silent for a while, then said, "Because you brought it to me in a notebook." He said, "You don't answer a notebook with a shovel. You brought me something written in ink, with columns and dates, and something like that deserves to end in ink. If I'd ended it the other way, I would have turned 4 years of your records into something entirely different, and I would have had to live with having done that." Then he added something that made the air in the room grow heavy. "There's something else you need to know," he said. Pike took all of it. He sat with the federal men for 3 hours and took responsibility for everything, from beginning to end. And he didn't say a single word about who had paid him. Not one word. A floor manager making more than $200,000 a year doesn't invent a scheme that runs for 7 years on his own, and he had no reason to extend credit to a gambler like your father on those particular nights, unless someone told him to do it. He's going to prison for someone else, and he's choosing to go. He looked down at his hands, which means there's still someone behind him. I don't know who yet. Marin stood. She walked out onto the balcony and remained there for a very long time, her back to the room, both hands resting on the railing as she looked toward the blackness over the sea. Salvatore didn't follow her and didn't say anything. He stayed exactly where he was and let her stand there, because he understood that this was the price of telling the truth, that a person couldn't speak the truth, and at the same time expect the one hearing it not to need to step outside for air. She stood there for nearly 20 minutes. Then she came back inside, closed the door behind her, and sat down across from him. "I need to say something," she said, "and I need you to hear all of it. I'm not closing my eyes to the kind of man you are. I know who you are. I knew before I ever got into a car to come here, and if I told you I didn't know, I'd be lying. And I'm not going to build a life on a lie. I look straight at it, and I'm staying. But I'm staying with one condition of my own, and that condition starts today." She placed both hands on the table. "Anything that passes through my hands has to end the way this ended today. With paperwork, with ink, with columns and dates. I won't give you my numbers so they can become something else. I won't live in a house where pages I've written become an excuse for something I don't even want to imagine. If there ever comes a day when something I bring to you ends another way, I leave that same day. No argument, no warning beforehand, not a word." She looked at him. "And you know I'm capable of leaving. You created the trust yourself that makes me capable of it. You made it to protect me from you, and now I'm using that exact thing to speak to you. I think you're fair enough to see the humor in that." Salvatore Corvino looked at his wife for a long time. Then he said, "Agreed." And he said it without hesitation. "Agreed. Exactly on your terms." And he added that this was the first time in 20 years anyone had sat across from him and drawn a boundary that he hadn't even considered trying to negotiate. And in the dining room of that stone house, the woman who had once walked 3 miles rather than accept a ride stopped being the woman who had been rescued and became the woman who set the rules. They kept to the terms exactly. Her room was at the eastern end of the house, his at the western end. And the house was large enough for 2 people to live in it for an entire week without seeing each other if that was what they wanted. But it turned out they were both early risers. And in a house where only 2 people were awake before 6 o'clock, the breakfast table was a very difficult place to avoid. The first week, they sat at opposite ends of the table and didn't say much. By the 3rd week, she had moved her chair closer because she said she didn't like having to raise her voice. By the 2nd month, it had become a habit. His coffee, her tea, and a stretch of silence neither of them felt any need to fill. One morning, she asked him why he never said what he liked. She said she had been there 7 weeks and had never once heard him say that he wanted anything, not even the smallest thing, not even a particular meal. Salvatore looked at his coffee for a while, then said his father had taught him that. He said his father had taught him from the time he was very young that a man in this house must never let anyone see him wanting something, because whatever a man wanted was exactly where someone else would put the knife. That desire was a hole in the armor, and that the moment a man revealed he needed something, he had handed someone else the price of himself. He said his father had first told him that when he was 6 years old, and had repeated it so many times that Salvatore no longer remembered when he had learned it, only that it was there, the way he knew which hand was his left. Maren set down her teacup. "That's the worst thing anyone could teach a child," she said. She didn't say it with pity, but in the flat, matter-of-fact voice of someone who had just found an incorrect expense in a ledger. Wanting something is the whole meaning of being alive. A man who's never allowed anyone to see him want anything is a man who's been taught to starve in the middle of a warehouse full of food. She looked up at him. "And I want to be clear about this. I don't pity you. You're a kingpin. You have 3 casinos and an entire harbor. You'll survive. And you won't get a single drop of pity from me. But I pity the 6-year-old boy who was taught that, because he did nothing to deserve being made that hungry." Salvatore had no answer for that. He sat in silence, and later he would remember that as the first morning of his life, when someone had spoken to him as though he were a human being, rather than a title. In accordance with the condition she had set at the dinner table that night, Salvatore formally placed the entire legitimate side of his business under her oversight, and Gus Renzi spent 3 weeks transferring the paperwork, wearing the expression of a man who had lived long enough not to ask why. There were 4 real estate companies, 2 transportation companies, an industrial laundry service, the legitimate operations of 3 casinos, and the entire warehouse system at the harbor, along with its lease agreements, utility bills, timesheets, and work schedules. Maren spent 2 months doing nothing but reading. She read the way she did everything else, from the beginning, skipping no pages, with a ruler and a pencil beside her. And one afternoon in March, while reorganizing a box of trust records that Gus's office had sent over, she pulled out a clipped set of papers and stopped. It was the formation document for an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary was Bertie Doyle. All medical expenses without limit, all tuition until the girl finished whatever she wanted to study, with no conditions attached, no one permitted to alter it, no one permitted to suspend it, including the person who created it. The creator's name appeared nowhere on any page except the final signature page, and in the upper right corner of the first page, machine stamped, were the date and time of filing. November 14th, 9 o'clock in the morning. Maren sat for a very long time with the paper in her hands. She was a record keeper, so she did what record keepers always did. She calculated. The night at the gaming table had been at 2 o'clock in the morning on November 14th. 7 hours. 7 hours after that man walked out of the casino, he had called his lawyer and signed something that could never be taken back, for a 19-year-old girl he had never met, who carried the same last name as a gambler he had just driven out of the city. And 3 days later, Maren had walked into that room for the first time. 3 days before he knew what she looked like. 3 days before there was anything for him to gain. That evening, she carried the paper downstairs and placed it in front of him without saying a word, simply set it down and waited. Salvatore looked at it, and he knew immediately what it was, and he didn't ask where she had found it. He didn't offer a long explanation. He didn't speak about kindness, and he didn't speak about duty. He said only one sentence. "I saw the word soon," he said. And I didn't want there to be one more week when you had to promise someone something you didn't have. She said nothing for the rest of that evening, and he didn't ask. But the following afternoon, when the sun had dropped low and the light over the back porch was fading with the sudden speed peculiar to March along the coast, she went looking for him, and she stood there with her arms folded across her chest and said, "I have a question, and I want a truthful answer." She asked why he had done that at 9 o'clock in the morning on November 14th. "I've been thinking about it for 24 hours, and I still can't find a column where it belongs. A man who wants to stop something ugly erases the debt and sends the man responsible away, and that's the end of it. You had already done that. No one establishes an irrevocable trust for a stranger's younger sister merely because he wanted to stop something ugly." Salvatore leaned against the railing for a while, then said he would answer. But first he wanted her to know that he had kept this answer to himself since November and hadn't intended ever to say it aloud, and that if, after hearing it, she wanted him never to mention it again, he never would. Then he spoke. He said he hadn't married her only to protect her. He said the protection was real. Every word of it had been true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and he had allowed her to believe it was the whole truth because that had been easier for both of them. He said a drowning man didn't always realize when he was reaching for shore. He said he had reached, and then wrapped that reaching in a contract with clauses in third-party administration, so neither of them would have to say the frightening thing out loud. And he said he was tired of disguising it. Marin raised a hand. "Stop there," she said. And for the first time in everything that had happened between them, her voice failed to remain level. It broke in the middle of the sentence, a fracture so small that only someone listening very carefully would have noticed. And he was listening very carefully. "You can't say things like that unless you're completely certain. I'm a practical person. I signed a practical agreement, and for the past 3 months, I've built an entire life on one understanding, that you don't need me. You only need the quiet I bring with me. I've arranged everything inside myself around that understanding. I've learned how to sit across from you at breakfast without expecting anything. And if you tell me now that you need me, and it turns out you're only feeling tender on a March afternoon when the light is fading, then you'll pull the floor out from beneath a woman who's already had the floor pulled out from under her once this year, and I can't afford a second time, so you have to be sure. I'm asking you to be certain before you say another word." Salvatore moved away from the railing. He didn't come closer. He simply straightened. He said he had never been more certain of anything in his life, and added that he had been certain of many things in his life, and had been right about nearly all of them. He said he wanted her, not her quiet. He said he wanted all of her difficult self, the way she kept asking until things made sense, the way she refused to let something wrong remain standing where it was wrong. He said he wanted even the carefully pressed coat she had worn to his house that November afternoon, and the way she had looked at him that day, not as though he were a dangerous man, but as though he were a stretch of bad weather she had decided she would walk through no matter what it cost her. He said he had been trying to manage this since November, because managing what he wanted was the only thing his father had taught him. And then the other morning she had sat across from him at breakfast and named that thing exactly for what it was, and since that day he hadn't been able to manage it anymore. He said he was falling in love with his own wife, and it was the most ridiculous predicament a man in his position could possibly find himself in, and he didn't care. The light over the porch had almost disappeared entirely. Marin stood motionless for a very long time, and he didn't step toward her, not because he didn't want to, but because the term said separate, and he wouldn't break a term she hadn't invited him to break. Not even now. Not even for this. "You're waiting for my permission," she said. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he replied. He said he had promised from the beginning that there would be no chains in this, and he had kept that promise, and he would keep it for the rest of his life if necessary. "The choice is yours. It has always been yours. I only want you to know that if there ever comes a day when you choose me, what you're choosing isn't a cold man." Then Marin Doyle crossed the distance between them. She did it the way she did everything, directly, without ornament, moving only after she had made up her mind. She stood in front of him and placed her hand against the front of his coat, directly over his heart, and said, "I choose you. It's in the ledger now. I won't cross it out." And Salvatore Corvino, the man who controlled the harbor and the unions and 3 casinos along the East Coast, lowered his head and rested his forehead against hers, and stayed there for a very long time in the gathering darkness, holding nothing in his hands except the hand she had placed against his chest, richer than he had been on any day he had ever lived. 6 months later, on a Friday afternoon, Jerry Doyle appeared at the bar on the ground floor of the Vermilion wearing a coat that had been brushed clean and carrying a story he had rehearsed carefully. He ordered a drink, and when someone sat down beside him, he began to tell it, and he told it well, in the way of a man who had been telling the same story over and over in his head for half a year. He said his daughter was now the wife of Salvatore Corvino, that she lived in a stone house in Longport, that she had money of her own in her own name, and that none of it had happened by accident, but because her father had been farsighted enough to put his daughter in the right room at the right time. He ordered a second drink. The guard at the door recognized his face before he heard the entire story and called upstairs. Someone called Salvatore's office, but Salvatore was at the harbor, and the second name on the list was Mrs. Corvino and Mrs. Corvino was in her office on the 12th floor. Marin listened to the entire report over the telephone, remained silent for 3 seconds, then said, "Bring him up here." Jerry Doyle was taken to the 12th floor, down the same corridor he had walked out of 6 months earlier with nothing left, and brought into a room exactly 2 doors away from the old gaming table. Marin was sitting behind a desk with 3 open files and a pen in her hand. She didn't stand. She didn't look up. "Go ahead, father," she said. "Let me finish this column." Then she finished the column, and for nearly a full minute, the only sound in the room was the scratch of her pen moving across the paper. Jerry Doyle had prepared himself for tears. He had prepared himself for an embrace, and even for the possibility that she would throw him out, and on the bus ride down he had rehearsed answers for all 3 possibilities. He hadn't prepared for this. He stood there with no idea what to do with his hands and began to speak. And with every sentence his voice lost a little more of its certainty. He said, "Look at you. I did well by you, didn't I?" He said, "There's something about my circumstances you must have heard, and when a father is in a difficult position and his child is settled as comfortably as you are, between father and daughter, well, you bet me at a gaming table," Marin said. She still didn't look up. Her pen didn't stop moving. "In front of 6 men. You pulled the notebook out of my apron pocket and threw it onto the pile of chips, and you said it loudly enough for the entire room to hear. I know everything. I knew that very night, before daylight, because in this business rumors travel faster than cars. You didn't wager a stranger. You wagered me. The daughter who kept your books, who paid for your groceries, who made sure you had the one decent coat you owned so you would have something to wear when you went out to lose. That's the account between you and me. It's very old. It carries a great deal of debt, and today you've come here asking to add more." Jerry's face twisted. He said he had been drunk. He said people said all kinds of things when they were drunk. "You were drunk for 6 straight years, she said. "And in all those years there wasn't a single night when you bet me. Not until the exact night when you had nothing else left to wager. The liquor only opened the door, father. The thing that walked through it was you." She set down her pen. She looked up, and there was no anger at all on her face. And that was far worse than anger. "I'm going to tell you what will happen, so you won't have to come all this way again. You will not get money from me. Not because I'm hard. I'm not hard. I once paid someone to look after my sister with my tips, while living in a house where there was nothing left. And I know how to soften toward people who deserve it. You don't. You spent your share years ago, and then you spent me too. There isn't a single cent left in that account. It's closed." Jerry Doyle's face flushed red, and that old cunning glint flashed in his eyes one last time. "Then I'll go see your husband," he said. "People say he indulges you. He won't let his wife's father end up on the street. I'll go see him." "Your daughter's husband is here," a voice said from the doorway. Salvatore had been standing there, no one knew for how long, because he had a way of arriving anywhere without making a sound. He stepped into the room, walked around the desk, and stopped beside his wife's right shoulder, just behind her chair, rather than placing himself in front of her. The place he chose to stand was, by itself, a complete sentence, and all 3 people in the room understood it. "You're going to listen to me," he said, "and then you're going to leave, and you won't come back. I told you that night that you were never to appear anywhere your daughter lived. You broke that condition. I could erase you for this, and you know very well that I can, because you've seen me do it to men far more decent than you. But I won't." He placed a sheet of paper on the desk, something Gus Renzi had drafted weeks earlier for precisely this day. "I won't, because my wife has just dealt with you far more fairly than I intended to, and I will not smear my anger across her judgment." She closed the account. "I'm only adding the interest. A monthly allowance, enough to give you a place to live and food to eat, paid to an address chosen by my people in a city far from here. 3 conditions. You do not gamble. The first time you sit down at a table, it stops. You do not return to New Jersey. And for as long as you live, you will never tell the story of that night as though it were some triumph of yours. If I hear that you've been sitting in some bar telling people how cleverly you married your daughter off to a kingpin, it stops that same day. Those are the terms. They are more than you deserve." Jerry Doyle looked at the paper, then looked at his daughter. Marin had picked up her pen again. She was continuing with her column of figures. She wasn't going to help him decide. He signed, his hand trembling so badly that his signature came out crooked, then took his copy and walked out. And he didn't say goodbye. And no one said goodbye to him. When the door closed, Marin let the pen fall onto the desk and released a long breath, and only then did Salvatore understand that the composure she had just shown had cost her far more than she had allowed anyone to see. He said nothing. He remained exactly where he was, beside her shoulder. After a while, she said, without turning to look at him, "My whole life, I've known men who stood in front of me to take care of things for me, and every one of them thought they were being kind. I've been managed on other people's behalf for so long that I thought that was the only way anyone could help a woman." She looked up at him. "I didn't know how badly I had been longing for someone to stand beside my shoulder until today." The annual fundraiser at the Boardwalk Hotel took place in November, and it was the only night of the year when all 5 families, 2 state legislators, 3 judges, and the entire city establishment sat beneath the same roof and pretended they had never known one another in any other way. Salvatore said he wasn't going that year. Marin said, "Yes, we are," she said. "You'll keep me in Longport for the rest of my life and call it protection. And I'll let you do it because it's warm here and cold out there, and that would be cowardice dressed up as decency, and I won't allow that to happen in my own house." She said, "What happened at the gaming table isn't dead. It's only sleeping. It's sleeping because no one has seen me. For the past year, this entire city has talked about me, and not one of those people has ever stood 3 steps away from me. When people can't see something for themselves, poisonous tongues can shape it into anything they want. I won't be a shape inside somebody else's mouth. I'll go to the biggest table they can set, and I'll sit there where they can look at me, long enough for them to see that I don't resemble the story they've been telling at all. That's how you close an account that refuses to stop whispering. You make it stand up under the lights and count it out." Salvatore looked at his wife and understood that she was right, and that she was braver than he was. And by then he knew her well enough to see the fear lying just beneath that steady voice, and to see that she had decided to walk straight through it because it was the right thing to do. He said, "Then we'll go, and I'll stand beside your shoulder, not in front of you, and you'll stay for exactly as much of the evening as you want, and not 1 minute more." That evening, before the car arrived, he handed her a small box. She opened it, and she sat down. Inside was her mother's delicate bracelet, the bracelet she had taken to a pawnshop on Pacific Avenue 4 years earlier to pay a medical bill. And for all 4 of those years, once a week, on the walk home from the bus stop, she had slowed down in front of that exact display case, and she had never told anyone about it, not even Bertie. Salvatore didn't explain how he had found it. He said only one thing: "I didn't buy it. I brought it home." Dinner was halfway through the main course when Cormac Halloran spoke. He sat diagonally across the table, 4 seats away from her, and he waited until the conversation around them had quieted before saying anything. And when he did, he spoke loudly enough for the 3 neighboring tables to hear, in the pleasant voice of a man who had spent his entire life turning cruelty into conversation. "Mrs. Corvino," he said, "you really must settle a question for the entire city. Is it true that your husband won you in a card game? Because if it is, I can only congratulate him on the finest hand ever dealt on the East Coast. And everyone here, myself included, is simply dying to know what he was holding." The entire room went still. This was the moment half the people present had bought tickets to witness, except it had been wrapped inside a joke. Salvatore set down his glass, and Gus Renzi, seated 2 tables away, saw the movement and knew exactly what it meant. But Marin placed her hand lightly over her husband's, and that touch spoke as clearly as words. "Wait." Then she turned toward Halloran and answered in a voice that carried every bit as well as his, clear and warm, and without the slightest tremor. "That isn't true, sir," she said. "And I'm glad you asked, because something false ought to be corrected under the lights, instead of being allowed to whisper in the dark. And you've just given me the lights. My husband did not win me at a gaming table. No one has ever won me anywhere, because I'm not a wager, and there isn't a man alive who can put me on a table. What happened, sir, since the entire city is dying to know, was this. A drunken man tried to wager something that didn't belong to him. My husband stopped him, took it off the table, paid to silence the matter, and asked for nothing in return. Then, a few days later, after having met me exactly once, He offered me his name to protect me from precisely the kind of whisper you were kind enough to repeat just now. And he offered it together with a trust in my name alone that even he couldn't touch by a single cent. A room of my own, and the right to leave him at any hour of any day, taking everything with me, and owing him no explanation. She let that sentence stand beneath the lights for a beat. I could have walked out of his house a free woman the very next morning, sir, and he arranged everything to make absolutely certain that I could. He deliberately made me the hardest woman in this state to own, because he recognized that I was a human being rather than an object before he had any reason at all to care about me. And afterward, because we're both practical people and both despise waste, we made the mistake of falling in love, entirely contrary to our own agreement, and that is how we came to be sitting here. She smiled, and it was a complete smile, and she didn't turn it toward Halloran. She turned it down the length of the table toward her husband. So you may tell the entire city, sir, that Salvatore Corvino didn't win me at a gaming table. He was much wiser than that. He set me free, and I chose him. That was the finest hand ever dealt on the East Coast, and he was holding nothing but the truth, and that's the only gamble worth taking. There was a silence. Then, from the far end of the table, Mrs. Rosalind Teague, 80 years old, widow of an old generation kingpin, and famous across the East Coast for having gone 40 years without being pleased by anything, slapped one hand hard against the table and burst out laughing. And that laugh shattered the silence into something entirely different. Not the murmuring sound of scandal, but the sound of 40 of the most important people in the room, deciding all at once that they were being won over. Cormac Halloran, who had come intending to inflict a wound, and found the blade turned backward in his own hand, managed a thin smile and an even thinner compliment, then disappeared into his wine, and for the rest of that season, he was never again the man everyone at the table feared as they had before. Gus Renzi rode back with them in the car, and he remained silent for nearly the entire drive, only speaking when the car turned off the avenue. And when he did, he spoke to Marin rather than Salvatore. "Ma'am," he said, "there's something you should know, and I think it's better that you hear it from me." He said that man hadn't gone there to mock her. He had gone there to light a fuse. He said Halloran hadn't cared how she answered, that he hadn't really been speaking to her at all. He had been speaking to her husband. The entire remark had been constructed for one purpose: to force her husband to stand up in a room where 2 state legislators and 3 judges were watching, because if her husband stood first, then everything that happened afterward could be treated as though her husband had started it, and Halloran would finally have the excuse he had spent 7 years looking for. Gus turned his hat slowly in his hands. "There were 4 cars waiting outside on the avenue tonight, ma'am. They were there before the appetizers were served, and they left at 11:15. You didn't win an argument tonight. You stopped a war with 4 minutes of civilized conversation, and you did it without even knowing what you were doing." Marin said nothing until they reached home. Only when they were inside the small room at the eastern end of the house, the room she had transformed from a cold, formal sitting room into the only place in that entire house where people actually sat, did she turn and ask her husband whether it was true. Salvatore said it was. He said he had known from Halloran's very first sentence, and he said he had set down his glass, and he said he wouldn't lie to her about what had been in his mind at that moment, that he had been ready to do exactly what those 4 cars had been waiting for. "If your hand hadn't come down on mine at that exact second, tonight would have ended very differently, and tomorrow there wouldn't be anyone in this state still talking about a fundraiser." Marin sat beside him, close beside him, in the warm room. "I don't need you to fight that war for me," she said. "I never needed that. What I need is to know that you would fight it. That's what all of this is, do you understand? I could stand up in front of the 40 most powerful people in that room, because I knew that at the far end of the table, there was a man who had already decided that if everything went wrong, he would burn the whole room down. A person can be very brave out in the light when she knows that behind her, in the darkness, there is warmth waiting." She looked down at her hands. "I was alone in every battle of my life until I met you. Every one, since the year my mother died. And until tonight, I thought what I had was strength. But I stood there, under those lights, wearing my mother's bracelet, and I realized that most of what I had called strength all these years was really just loneliness, wearing armor, because when a person has no one, she has no choice but to become hard. You took the loneliness out of it. What's left is still strength, but it's so much lighter, and I have to thank you for that lightness." Salvatore held her hand and said nothing for a long time. But inside his mind, in that compartment where he had always stored the things whose time hadn't yet come, another line had just been written, and there was nothing warm about it. A man had spent 7 years searching for an excuse, and tonight he had lost it in front of the entire city. A man like that wouldn't give up. A man like that would simply begin looking for another way. The other way came in January of the following year, during the second winter of their marriage, on a windless night when the water in the harbor lay flat as a sheet of black glass. It happened around warehouses 4 and 7, where the freight containers belonging to the transportation company were stacked in long rows, and afterward the story was told only in fragments by people who had been far away, because the people who had been close did not tell it at all. The night watchman at the cruise pier nearly a mile away said that sometime around midnight he heard sounds carrying across the water, and flat water carried sound a very long way, and he didn't know what those sounds were, only that they weren't the sounds of ordinary loading work. A woman who lived in a 5th-floor apartment on the Baltic Street side said she saw headlights sweep across the wall of warehouse 7 several times, the lights passing over it and disappearing, then sweeping across again, the way cars moved when they were looking for something rather than simply passing through. Then there were very long stretches of silence, long enough that the woman said she thought whatever was happening had ended and she had gone back to bed, only for another burst of sound to come afterward. By around 1 o'clock in the morning, the harbor had gone completely quiet, and no ambulance came, and no police car came either, because in that part of the city people didn't call for such things. In the stone house at Longport, the telephone rang at 1:15 in the morning. Maren picked it up on the first ring, because she had always been a light sleeper, and because for weeks she had been sleeping with the feeling of someone waiting for a telephone call she didn't want to receive. The voice on the other end belonged to Gus Renzi, and he said exactly 3 sentences, and the third was, "Open the back door and send everyone in the house to bed." They brought Salvatore home close to 2 o'clock. They couldn't take him to a hospital, because a name like his appearing in an admissions ledger that night would have brought consequences worse than the night itself. The family's private doctor arrived 20 minutes later, an elderly man carrying 2 cases who asked no questions. He worked in the bedroom in the West Wing for more than 3 hours, and when he finally came out, he washed his hands for a very long time at the hallway sink before speaking to Maren. He said this would be difficult not because of tonight, but because of the days that followed. He said the wound in the leg was something he could treat, but what came afterward was something he couldn't control. And he used exactly one word: infection, and he said it in the voice of a man who had watched that word kill more people than anything else in his profession. He told her to prepare herself for a high fever. The fever came the following afternoon, and stayed for 11 days. Maren entrusted his care to no one, not because she didn't trust the people in the house, but because she was a keeper of records, and she knew that what killed people in situations like this wasn't cruelty but carelessness, one dose given at the wrong hour, one dressing change skipped, because the person on duty was tired. She placed a small table beside the bed and made a chart: time, medication, dosage, signature, and she filled it in herself every single time. Even at 3 o'clock in the morning, even when her hands were shaking, she measured every dose with a graduated cup, rather than a spoon. There were times when he was awake enough to argue, to say he didn't need it, and she lifted his head with one arm and said, "Drink, I've calculated it. Exactly this much, no more. Don't argue with the books." The nights were the hardest part. The fever climbed highest around 2 o'clock and carried him away from the room, and he began speaking to people who weren't there. For the first 3 nights she tried talking to him, calling his name, reminding him where he was, and none of it worked. On the 4th night, for reasons she never fully understood, she reached for a file she had brought upstairs from the office and began reading aloud. She read the casino's weekly operating report. She read invoices from the industrial laundry company, line by line, the number of tablecloths, the number of napkins, transportation costs. She read the elevator maintenance schedule: elevator 1 last month, elevator 3 next month, the technician's note about a component that needed replacement in the coming quarter. She read in the same steady, dull voice she used when reading a column of figures, and he grew quiet. He didn't fully wake, but his breathing slowed, his hands stopped clawing at the blanket, and he lay still and listened. She discovered that it worked, and she used it for all 11 nights, and afterward she thought she understood why. A person who was drifting needed a rope, and sometimes the best rope wasn't a prayer but the sound of ordinary, boring things continuing to happen. Napkins being counted, elevators being maintained, a house still being kept. It was a way of telling someone that the world was still here and still needed him to come back to it. Throughout those 11 days, Salvatore's people tore everything apart trying to discover who had known his schedule that night. Only 7 people had known he would be at Warehouse 4 at that hour. 7 people, and every one of them was investigated, and not one of the 7 showed a single trace of anything. Gus Renzi worked for 3 straight days, and after those 3 days he could report only one thing. He had found nothing. The 9th night was the worst. The old doctor came at 10 o'clock and stayed, and the fact that he stayed was an answer in itself, because for all 8 nights before that, he had gone home. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, Salvatore woke, and he woke in the strange way people who are gravely ill sometimes do, completely awake, clearer than he had been even on his healthy days, with the kind of lucidity the old doctor recognized and said nothing about, but quietly stepped out of the room and closed the door behind him. He saw his wife sitting right there beside the bed, and he saw how many days she had gone without sleep, and he saw on her face the fear she normally kept pressed so carefully beneath that level voice, now lying completely exposed on the surface, and he understood that he might be leaving. And he understood that there was exactly one thing he needed to say before he did. "Marin," he said, and his voice was little more than something broken. "Listen to me. If I don't make it." She told him not to say it. He said, "No, you have to listen, because I'm not sure I'll be awake again." He told her the trust in her name couldn't be touched by anyone, not by him, not by his family, not by any court. He told her Bertie's trust was permanent, that it didn't stop when he stopped, that it would continue until the girl finished studying whatever she wanted to study, and would provide for her care for the rest of her life, and that not one word of it could be changed. He told her she would still have the name, and the name would still protect her, because he had given that order in front of the people who needed to hear it 2 years earlier, and an order like that didn't need repeating. You'll be free. You can go anywhere you want, live however you want, marry anyone you want. You won't owe anyone a cent, and you won't owe anyone an explanation. He stopped to breathe, and every breath was hard work. "I took care of all of it 2 years ago," he said. "I did it so you would never be trapped, even by loving me. I need you to know that I did that I set you free, even from this, even from how this ends." And Marin Doyle, who hadn't cried once in 3 years, hadn't cried while standing with a tray in her hands on the 12th floor, hadn't cried when her father signed the papers and walked away, hadn't cried beneath 40 lights at the Boardwalk Hotel, lowered her face into her husband's burning hand and cried. She cried the way strong people cry, not in drops but in a flood, all 3 years at once. And the old doctor stood in the hallway outside, heard her, and didn't come in. Then she raised her head, and her face was wet, and she was angry in the way only the deepest love can make a person angry. "You really are a cold-hearted fool," she said. "After all this time, you still don't understand, do you? You set me free so that whatever I chose would be my choice and not because I was chained. Yes, you did that. It was the kindest thing a man has ever done for me, and I've been grateful to you every day. But now you listen carefully, Salvatore Corvino, and write this down in that ledger you keep behind those cold eyes of yours, and don't you dare cross it out. I'm free. I've been free all this time, and a free woman is sitting in this room on the worst night of her life, measuring every dose of your medicine with a graduated cup and reading napkin invoices to you at 3 o'clock in the morning. She's here, at the exact hour when there is nothing left to gain, and everything to lose. You couldn't buy this. Your money can't reach this place. This is the only thing I have that is worth anything. And tonight, I'm spending all of it on you, willingly, because I love you. So you are not leaving. You are going to drink all of that medicine, and you are going to hold my hand, and you are going to stay, because I'm choosing you, and I have never chosen wrong, and I don't intend to start being wrong with the man I love. Do you hear me? Stay." The fever broke before dawn. No one knew whether it was the medicine, or whether it had simply reached the point when it was bound to fall, as fevers sometimes do, or whether there wasn't a man alive, not even one preparing to leave this world, who could argue with Marin Doyle once she had made up her mind and written it into the ledger. The old doctor came in just as daylight was beginning and stood looking at him for a long time, then told the housekeeper that he was going to live, and that he thought the lady of the house was the one who had decided it, and that he wasn't foolish enough to argue the matter with her. At noon that day, Bertie called from school, worried because her sister hadn't sent her a message in 3 days, and Marin carried the telephone into the hallway, leaned back against the wall, and told her everything was fine, that she had only been busy, that Bertie should concentrate on her studies and remember to eat a proper breakfast. Then, in the days that followed, while Salvatore was still confined to bed and couldn't yet sit up, Marin did the one thing she knew how to do, and had always done whenever something wrong remained standing where it was wrong. She wrote things down and she compared them. The entire warehouse system at the harbor fell under the legitimate side of the business she had been managing for more than a year, which meant every invoice, every timesheet, Every service contract for that part of the harbor sat in her own filing cabinets. She began where no one ever bothered to look, with the invoices from the industrial laundry company serving the warehouse district, and she compared them against the timesheets from the final 3 months. Then she found the first thing that didn't match. From the first discrepancy, she followed the trail to another small service invoice and found the second. The third was a prepaid telephone number that appeared in the payment records of a subcontractor, a number that had made 3 calls during the week before the night at the harbor and was never used again afterward. 3 numbers that didn't match. She sat with them through an entire night, and she checked everything again from the beginning 3 times, because she was a woman who didn't say something unless she was certain. On the day Salvatore managed to sit up for the first time, propped against the pillows, Marin walked into the room, placed a sheet of paper in front of him, and said 2 words. "It's Renato." Her 3 numbers weren't evidence, and she was the first person to say so. She told her husband that they weren't enough to accuse anyone of anything, that they only told him where to dig, and that if he dug in the right place and found nothing, then he had to accept that she was wrong. Gus Renzi took the paper and needed 10 days. The prepaid telephone number had been purchased with cash at a convenience store that had a security camera, and that camera kept its footage for 30 days, and 10 days was just barely soon enough. From there, they traced an account, and from the account, they traced 2 transfers. And those 2 transfers opened onto something far larger than a single night at the harbor, because it turned out that the person who had been paying Wendell Pike for 7 years wasn't some outsider. It was Renato Corvino himself. For 7 years, his cousin had been paying to keep gamblers like Jerry Doyle sitting at the tables in his own family's casino. Not to squeeze money out of them, but to create debts that could later be sold, strings that could be handed to outsiders, and Cormac Halloran was the man who had been buying them. The wedge Halloran had spent 7 years searching for wasn't something he had discovered on his own. Someone inside the family had sharpened it for him and placed it in his hand. Salvatore called the council together on an afternoon in March, and he arrived using a cane, and he made no attempt to hide it, something every person in the room noticed. He placed the file in the center of the table and presented it in order. Invoices first, timesheets afterward, the convenience store footage, the 2 money transfers, and finally, the notarized statement of a subcontractor whom Gus Renzi had persuaded that telling the truth was the least terrible option left to him. Salvatore never raised his voice once. He didn't need to. In that world, there were rules older than anyone sitting in that room, and the oldest rule of all was that no one sold his own family to outsiders, and Renato Corvino had broken that rule for 7 years on paper, and paper couldn't argue. He walked out of that room alive that day, and that was the only thing he had left. Every part of the business, every account, every position, every right to sit at any table from there to Boston, all of it was stripped away, and it was stripped from him under the very rules of the game in which he had been raised. No one touched him. There was no need. That evening, when Salvatore returned home, he sat down very slowly because of his leg, and said only one thing to his wife about what had happened. "You told me that anything passing through your hands had to end in paperwork," he said. "This is the paperwork." Spring came late that year, but it came. His left leg never returned completely to what it had been, and never would. And he would carry a slight limp in cold weather for the rest of his life. And he discovered that he didn't mind it at all, that in fact he cherished it, because it was the mark of the winter when she had chosen him at the exact moment there was nothing left to gain. He practiced walking again along the long hallway on the 2nd floor every morning, a little farther each day, until one morning he set the cane down at the far end of the hall and walked the rest of the way without it. And he covered that distance without once thinking that he might fall. Marin stood at the other end watching him come toward her, and there was a full smile on her face. "Don't look so triumphant," he said. "It's only a leg," she said. "It isn't the leg. It's that you put the cane down without thinking about it, and then you walked, and you never once thought about falling, because you knew that if you fell, I'd catch you. Not so long ago, the coldest man in this state would rather have died than let anyone see that he needed to be caught. You just did it in front of me without even realizing it. That's worth smiling about." Then he came to stand beside her, at her shoulder as he always did, and he said something he had carried inside himself for 2 years. He said he wanted to end the terms. Separate rooms, opposite ends of the house, the entire careful structure he had built 2 years earlier to make certain she would never feel owned. He said it had done what it was meant to do, and it had been the right thing to build, but he had built it for a stranger who had just been wagered at a table, and had every reason in the world to fear men. "You aren't that stranger anymore, and I'm not that man to you anymore, and the wall we agreed to keep between us has stopped being protection and become nothing but a wall. Then he said the most important part, and he said it very clearly. I'm not asking you to give up $1 of the trust. And I'm not asking you to surrender one line of your right to leave. That stays. It stays intact until the day I die, and after that, if 20 years from now you wake up and can't bear me anymore, you can still walk out the door with everything, and owe me nothing. I will never take that back, because it is the truest thing I have ever given you. I'm only asking you to stop standing beside the door. A wall says you aren't allowed to leave. An open door, with you standing in the middle of the house beside me, says that every day you look at that door, and every day you choose to stay. I want the second thing. I want the door open, and you choosing the fire, every day, for however many days were given. Marin didn't answer immediately. She walked to the end of the hallway, picked up the cane, brought it back, and pushed it into his hand. You'll need this to get up the stairs to the other end of the house, she said. Your leg isn't nearly as healed as your pride thinks it is, and I have no intention of letting you fall halfway to your wife's room and ruin 3 months of my work just because you're too proud to use a cane. And that was her answer, spoken in the only grammar she had ever truly trusted, and Salvatore understood every word of it. And he laughed, and he took the cane. The years that followed passed in the way good years often do, quickly and with very little worth telling, and both of them found that strange, because both had been taught from childhood that good years belonged to other people, while their own part was simply to keep the books. Bertie graduated on a May morning, and Marin and Salvatore sat in the family section, and when the girl's name was called, the woman who had spent 4 years carrying trays on the night shift to pay that tuition applauded without being able to say a word. Later, Bertie became a nurse at a hospital 40 minutes from home, and every Sunday afternoon she came back for dinner, and the stone house in Longport began to fill with laughter on weekends, something that house hadn't known for the 40 years before. Marin kept the books for the entire legitimate side of the business, and she knew the name of every warehouse tenant at the harbor, knew which roof leaked, knew which family had a child about to enter college. Then, gradually, without anyone arranging it, young women from the harbor district began to be sent to her by their mothers, students, and young workers, between 20 and 25 years old, coming to sit at the long table in her office among the ledgers, and she told each of them the very thing no one had ever told her. You aren't a wager. She told them, there isn't a man anywhere in this world who can win you, because you aren't something that can be put on a table. Never let anyone decide your life for you through an intermediary, through pressure, or through fear. And if you have to wait, then wait. Even if it takes your whole life, until you find someone who looks at you the other way. And at that point, she would often glance toward the far end of the room, where her husband still sat through those conversations under the excuse that there was harbor business to attend to, and she would say, the way that man over there is looking at me. Jerry Doyle died in a small boarding house in a southern town after many years of keeping every condition exactly, never gambling, never returning to New Jersey, never telling anyone the story of that night. He kept his word, not because he became a better man at the end of his life, but because fear kept him in the place where love had never managed to hold him. Marin went to the funeral alone, because she insisted on going alone, and she stood beside the grave of the man who had once wagered her, then came home with dry eyes and said only 2 words. It's done. Salvatore didn't ask another question. 2 years later, one evening on the back porch, when his hair had turned gray and the limp in his left leg had become an old companion, Salvatore handed his wife an envelope. Your father sent this to me, not to you, and he told me never to tell you about it. I've kept it for 2 years. I'm giving it to you today because I've thought about it for those 2 years, and I've decided that hiding something from you that belongs to you is another way of deciding for you through an intermediary, and I don't do that to you. Whether you read it or not is your choice. If you want to burn it, I'll sit here with you while we burn it. She opened it. Inside was a sheet of lined paper torn from a cheap notebook, bearing a few lines written in a trembling hand. He had written, That girl kept records for 27 years in my house, and I never opened them once to look. You opened them in one night. He had written, That is the entire difference between the two of us, and it took me my whole life to understand it. He had written, Don't tell her. She doesn't owe me another second. Marin read the whole thing twice. She didn't cry. She folded the paper along its old creases and held it in her palm. Then she said, In the end, he finally looked. He just looked from too far away and far too late. And that was the real tragedy of my father. Not that he was cruel, because he was never strong enough to be truly cruel. The tragedy was that he waited until there was no one left there for him to see. She turned toward her husband, and after all those warm years her eyes were calm. Two men decided my life for me, you know. One kept me for 27 years and never saw me once. The other saw me before he ever had the chance to keep me. Salvatore lifted her hand and held it against his chest, over the very place where long ago he had tucked a cloth-bound notebook into the inside pocket of his coat. I didn't win you, he said. No one did, and you were never a wager. You chose me when you belonged completely to yourself, when you had money of your own, a name of your own, and could walk through any door in this country without owing anyone an explanation. And you've chosen me every day since. That's a fortune no gaming table has ever held and no safe could ever contain. I own an entire harbor, Marin, and I've owned it for most of my life, and not once did it make me warm. Then one night, someone threw an expense notebook onto a table, and it turned out to be the only thing in this world worth picking up. Evening settled around them, and the two of them remained there on the back porch of the house that had once been cold for 40 years, and was cold no longer, in an entirely ordinary evening of a life built on the exact place where one life had nearly been thrown away. And perhaps that is what this story is meant to leave with us. A person's worth doesn't lie in the price others place on them, but in whether someone is willing to look long enough to truly see them. So many of us have spent whole lives beside the people we love without ever stopping long enough to really see them, and so many others have quietly held entire families together without anyone ever noticing. And real love, whether romantic love or the love of family, always begins by giving the other person their freedom back. It never begins with owning them. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did Marin's story make you feel? And in your own life, has anyone ever taken the time to look at you that deeply? Please leave a few words in the comments. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your heart. We wish you and your family lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.